Hello, church history friends. My name is Barb Walden, and today I have the joy of welcoming you to the 8th lecture, a bonus lecture, in the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation's Summer Lecture Series. We greatly appreciate you joining us today to listen to Andrew Bolton share on this historic day. Now, before we jump into Andrew's lecture, I want to introduce you to our co-hosts who will be helping behind the scenes today. Our first co-host is Peter Smith. Peter is a member of the Board of Directors for the Historic Sites Foundation and has served as an incredible co-host for our annual Historic Sites bus tours since 2013. I also want to spotlight Megan Reed, another remarkable person who will serve as a co-host tonight. Megan is working on her master's degree at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. This summer, she's also serving as a student intern for the Kirtland Temple and is assisting behind the scenes throughout the lecture series. It was announced earlier this week that the Community of Christ Historic Sites will be closed until the end of the year. It was a difficult decision, but one made for the safety of our visitors, volunteers, and staff due to COVID-19. Despite the closure, the stories from church history and the preservation and maintenance of the historic sites continues on, even in the midst of a pandemic. Donations received from today's lecture will help support the Community of Christ Historic Sites. In fact, our board of directors has promised to double the donations for the first $12,000 in donations received during our summer campaign. Megan has dropped an online donations link in the chat box. She has also included the mailing address for anyone wishing to send a donation. Thank you for helping support the ongoing preservation and maintenance of our shared heritage this weekend. Now for the lecture. Our guest speaker today is Andrew Bolton, someone who has lived in many of the historic places mentioned in today's program. Andrew is married to Jewel Holmes, who grew up in Independence and met Harry Truman regularly as a little girl. Andrew and Jewel now live back in Leicester, England, but for 20 years they lived in Independence, Missouri. So Andrew knows something about the story of this city both of Zion and the atom bomb. For 2 years, Andrew and Jewel lived in Japan, teaching English in the church's school in Tokyo. Their little boy, Matthew, could speak fluent Japanese, and they became pregnant with their second son, David, while in Japan. When Andrew was in the Council of 12, his field assignment included Asia, and he regularly visited Japan over a 9-year period. In 2010, it was the 50th anniversary of the church in Japan, and President Vesey was a guest. As part of this trip, Andrew and President Vesey went together on a pilgrimage to Hiroshima and heard Nobel Peace Laureates talk about peacemaking. In today's lecture, 75 years later, Ending War, Forging Peace, Andrew brings together Japan and the USA, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and independence, and the founding of the United Nations. He will also connect the 8th of August, 1945 with the 8th of August, 2020. So welcome back, Andrew, and thank you for joining us. I'll turn the microphone over to you as we are all ready to hear Ending War and Forging Peace.
Thank you very much, Barbara. It was lovely to see people's names arriving for this program. I see lots of friends. Hello to all of you. I want to just especially mention Tim Prescott from Australia, for whom this is the middle of the night, I think, or very late in the evening. So hello, Tim, and others perhaps that are down under as well. As Barbara said, the title of the presentation today is 75 Years Later, Ending War, Forging Peace, the Legacy of U.S. President Truman and the Mission of Community of Christ, a reflection on the fateful day of August the 8th, 1945. So we're talking to begin with about Harry S. Truman, the 33rd US president. I think this is a marvelous painting of him that is in the Harry Truman Library and Museum in Independence. This is his home. This is where he spent many years and where he retired to as well. And you can go around this in non-pandemic times. This is the Library and Museum, the Presidential Library and Museum, also in Independence. This is on 24th Street. There used to be a good restaurant just above it. I used to meet with Paul Edwards. And this is a statue of Harry Truman outside the courthouse on the Independence Square with his characteristic cane and striding forth on his walks. So now we come to tell the story of a little girl called Jewel Holmes with her, and this is a picture of Jewel with her grandparents. She and her granddad Holmes would walk in Independence and meet Harry Truman, also walking Independence. They knew each other. So Mr. Truman would say, "Good morning, Mr. Holmes," and Mr. Holmes would say, "Good morning, Mr. Truman." So I think that's a lovely story. Let's begin by telling the really important story of the founding of the United Nations on the 26th of June, 1945. This is the actual insignia that was used on that occasion. It's really quite American-centered, but you can't really see Argentina, which was in disfavor at this time because of its support of the Nazi regime in Germany. So on this day, secretaries of states, ambassadors signed the UN Charter. And here we have Edward Stefanos, Secretary of State, doing that for the United States, with President Truman looking on. So the founding of the United Nations. It was a conference of 3,500 delegates and staff from 50 nations who worked together for 2 months, beginning in April 1945. This was no small affair. And the press were interested because there were 2,500 members of the press from all over the world. The founding of the United Nations goes back to the 1941 Declaration of St. James Palace in London, one of the royal palaces. But it has roots in the ill-fated League of Nations set up after World War I in the hope of bringing peace, arbitration between nations instead of war, but failed in part because the United States Senate refused to join. That was the period of US isolation. So even though the President Wilson, was gung-ho for international cooperation to end war, the Senate was not. So I'm going to now have Jewel read the opening, a few lines of the UN Charter.
We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to humankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small.
So for me, this has the historic echo and importance of Magna Carta 1215, or the Declaration of Independence in 1776. This is a significant document that builds on those previous documents of hope. President Truman, after the signing on that day, said the Charter of the United Nations, which you have just signed, is a solid structure upon which we can build a better world. History will honor you for it. Between the victory in Europe and the final victory in this most destructive of all wars, you have won a victory against war itself. So beautiful words, poignant words. The next day, the New York Herald Tribune, in its European edition, has the headline, United Nations Adopt World Charter. And there's an article about President Trump's speech, President Truman's speech there. The very next day, Wednesday, the 27th of June, President Truman is back in his hometown. He flies to Utah, stays there in Salt Lake City overnight, and then flies to Kansas City. He speaks in the RLDS auditorium, the largest facility in the city, to a packed audience that night. I talked to a member of staff some years ago from the Truman Library, a very lovely lady. I never met her, but we met on the phone. And she talked about being a 4-year-old child in this packed auditorium as history was being made. So Truman said in that speech, and we have a copy of that, that he had 2 tasks remaining in this beginning first 2 months or 3 months of his presidency. The first was to win the war against Japan. And he said, we're winning it. And there was thunderous applause. And the second task, he said, was to win the peace. And the previous day, the signing of the UN Charter was part of that winning of the peace. And again, there was applause. The next day, he's still in Kansas City, and it's the 5th anniversary of the law department of the University of Kansas City. And I guess it must have been an outdoor affair by this photograph. President Truman had taken a course in law, but not completed it in the 1930s. And on this occasion, he received a doctorate of law, which he said was the easiest degree he'd ever got. He also talked about the significance of the UN Charter that had just been signed 2 days earlier. He said in this speech, using the analogy of the United States, that if Kansas and Colorado have an issue on water rights over the Colorado River, they don't go to war. They go to the Supreme Court if they can't negotiate a settlement. And then he talked in folksy terms of the family's August picnic. They went to Lone Jack, which I believe is in western Jackson County. And I've been through Lone Jack many times. So he's telling people about this picnic. I'm sure the audience is fully with him. And then he says this: the world is no longer county size, no longer state size, no longer nation size. It is one world in which we must all get along. The vistas of a local boy grew to a world-sized vision, and I really like that. On the 2nd of July, President Truman went back to the Senate to meet his old colleagues. He had been a senator for about 10 years, and he appealed to the Senate to ratify the UN Charter. Remember, the US Senate did not do this after World War I with disastrous results. The Senate passed the ratification by a huge majority. And then on August the 8th, 1945, James F. Burns, a new Secretary of State, is with President Truman in the signing of this ratification of the UN Charter into law. The United States is the first country to do this. I find that so encouraging and so important. By October the 24th of that year, enough countries had signed it for it to become an institution binding on those that had signed the ratification. Kofi Annan was Secretary General of the United Nations from 1997 to 2006. And on his last public speech, his last public engagement, he came to Independence to give a speech at the Truman Library. And it was in December, and I was invited. I was very pleased. And in this speech, he says a few words about the importance of the United Nations and its founding. And Julie's going to read this.
If FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was the architect of the United Nations, President Truman was the master builder and the faithful champion of the organization in its first years.
Now, the background to this very important speech by Kofi Annan was that the then administration with President Bush was not so cooperative and not so gung-ho for the United Nations. So he's making a point. The same morning after the speech, we all went over to the UN Plaza, Peace Plaza. Again, you can see it's by the auditorium. You have this young girl reaching for a dove, reaching for peace, reaching for the sky. It's a beautiful fountain, and he laid a wreath there. This is the only memorial to those soldiers who have died in peacekeeping operations for the United Nations, the only memorial in the world. What else happened on August the 8th, 1945? Remember, President Truman had said in the auditorium the day after signing the UN Charter that he had two immediate tasks: to win the war against Japan and to win the peace. So winning the peace was already in place with the signing and ratification of the UN Charter. Win the war with Japan resulted in the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima on the 6th of August, and then on Nagasaki on the 9th of August, local time. The dropping of the bomb on Nagasaki, though, was on August the 8th, late in the evening, US time. So on this fateful day, August the 8th, President Truman ratified the UN Charter to secure the peace, to build the peace. And the war was effectively ended against Japan with the dropping of the second atom bomb on Nagasaki. Of course, the results were devastating. So let's look at Truman's decision for a moment. There are perhaps 250,000 victims: men, women, children, babies, the unborn. Most of the victims were civilians. In Nagasaki, of the 80,000 who died 80,000 who died instantly, there were only 114 soldiers. This action violated the just war criteria of civilian immunity. According to the just war criteria, civilians cannot be directly targeted. It also violated the criteria of proportionality and using also a weapon of mass destruction. So was President Truman guilty of a war crime? This, of course, is a very difficult question to ask, but an important one. The Nuremberg trials were just beginning in Germany after World War II had ended, and Nazi war criminals were being tried. I spoke with a German friend on Friday, and we talked about whether President Truman was also guilty of a war crime, since he was responsible for nearly 250,000 deaths, and any Nazi guilty of so many victims would surely have been tried at this time. Two terrible events the only fully of nuclear weapons. Truman on trial. The Truman Library Museum has had an exhibition about the decision to drop the atom bomb. It's run for nearly 20 years. It ended this November 2019. And if you went to the exhibition, maybe some of you have seen it. On one side, there were quotes by historians and significant figures that said the decision to drop the bombs was wrong, was not necessary, it was ill-considered, it was immoral. And on the other side, you had a list of important voices and historians saying it was a good thing that the bomb had been dropped. And then there was a book in which you, the visitor, the guest, could sign it. I took Ila Gandhi to see the exhibit, and she wrote in the book her disapproval. There's an award-winning educational curriculum available for British schools for 13 to 16-year-olds called Truman on Trial. And the children act out, learn about the moral questions, the history, and so on, and then come to a decision about the guilt or innocence of Truman. One of the quotes in the exhibition is this quote that President Truman wrote in a letter to Samuel M. Calvert, who was head of the Federal Council of Churches. And you'll see that it's only 2 days after the dropping of the bomb in Nagasaki. The Federal Council of Churches became the National Council of Churches, which Community of Christ is a member, became a member of 10 years ago.
Nobody is more disturbed over the use of atomic bombs than I am, but I was greatly disturbed over the unwarranted attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor and their murder of our prisoners of war. When you have to deal with a beast, you have to treat him as a beast. It is most regrettable, but nevertheless true.
So it's interesting to read his forceful words here, and also his use of the word beast. Eisenhower said, I thought that our country should avoid shocking world opinion by the use of a weapon whose employment was, I thought, no longer mandatory as a measure to save American lives. It was my belief that Japan was at that very moment seeking some way to surrender with a minimum loss of face. Now, loss of face is a very important issue in Japanese culture. We Westerners belong to a guilt culture, but in the East, in Japan, it's a shame culture. So it's very important to minimize loss of face. And I'm glad that Eisenhower understood this. He, of course, was the famous, very competent American general in charge of the D-Day landings in 1944, and then ran for president successfully and took over from Harry Truman in 1953. So the question is now coming to you. Should Truman have ordered dropping the atomic bombs? Yes or no? Please be thinking of your question as we see if we can run this poll. So please click So I think we've reached the end of the voting. With 80% voting, I don't see much movement now. So should President Truman have ordered the dropping of the atom bomb? 45% of you say yes, and 55% say no. So thank you for voting. And maybe we could take the voting thing away now, please. Okay, well, thank you very much for voting. So it's a difficult question, isn't it? I want to now tell the story of Community of Christ around these issues. So I'm fascinated by the importance of the church seal and its power to shape us. And you can see all the church seals in various editions from the original 1874 to the 2001 and also the web one. So I love the church seal. Often it's been the only artwork in our chapels. So I love the idea that the church seal is visual theology. We usually use words for theology, but the church seal is visual theology, which recalls to our mind Isaiah chapter 11, the first 10 verses, the coming of the Messiah, and then lion and lamb lying down together. This visual theology has shaped our mission and identity and reminded us of our calling. It's very important. Our beautiful temple in Independence, dedicated to the pursuit of peace, reconciliation, and healing of the spirit, inspired by the Redeemer of the world, is a grand symbol soaring 300 feet into the sky in hope of peace. And at the heart of this beautiful temple is a Japanese meditation garden. So this Japanese meditation garden is only a few hundred yards from President Truman's home. It's maybe half a mile from President Truman's library and museum. So I find the juxtaposition in the city of Zion, also the city of the atom bomb, the juxtaposition of a garden, a meditation garden. And I find it also interesting that the big windows overlooking it are the windows of President Veazey's office. And we're looking through the windows of the meditation chapel, perhaps for me, the most beautiful worship space in the whole church, with the 8 sacraments of the church on the walls. I love doing tours here. So, a Japanese meditation garden. Every culture is a mixture of good and bad, evil and beauty. My dad used to grow chrysanthemums and was very good at it. I thought he was the best in the world till I went to Japan, and they were so much better. The 2 years that we lived in Japan, I found, Jewel and I found wonderful years. And people in Japan became our soulmates, and that continues to this day. The people that we met, the parents of the children that we taught, treated us so kindly, so respectfully. They were so kind to our little boy, Matthew. In fact, Matthew helped introduce us to many Japanese people because they're quite a child-centered culture. I don't think of Japanese people as beasts. I love this brilliant photograph overlooking the World Plaza. In the foreground is swords being beaten into plowshares. And then you have the church sealed doors through which we come from inspireship to go and make peace and justice in the world. And we have the beautiful stained glass windows shown magnificently here of the fields are ripe, all ready to harvest. There's work to do. I mentioned Ela Gandhi earlier. Ela Gandhi is the granddaughter of Mahatma Gandhi. She knew her granddad. In fact, she complained about having to eat too much pumpkin, and he changed the diet of the community they were living in, the ashram they were living in. In 2002, at the World Conference that year, Ela Gandhi received the Church's International Peace Award for her witness, her courageous witness in apartheid South Africa. Her part of the family lived in South Africa. She lost a son in that struggle. Ela Gandhi was always a voice for nonviolent resistance, following her grandfather's lead. This statue, created by Brother Martin, an evangelist in the church, and he did this statue for free, we just paid for the materials, is of this beautiful passage from Isaiah chapter 2. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Now, this was covered with black plastic for conference week. People didn't know what was under it. And then on a Tuesday lunchtime, straight after the business session, we gathered for 15 minutes to take off the black plastic. And the people that took off the black plastic to reveal the statue was the president of the church, Grant McMurray, and Ela Gandhi. It's a holy moment. There were 3,000 people there. Dave Martin was there, the artist as well. And he talked about being a Duff. He was a Korean War veteran. Let's share for a few moments some stories about Charles Neff. He was the first apostle to Asia in 1960, served in the Council of 12 for 24 years. I met him when Jewel and I were living in Japan. He came and talked with us, and that was a lovely encounter. Hiroshima. Neff was here 3 weeks after the bomb had been dropped. Neff was captain of a landing craft, and a very dangerous job. He said to his friend Clifford Cole, also president of the Council of 12, that he would, if called up to go to war again, rather go to prison than go to war. Seeing the Pacific War marked him. He was a Baptist growing up, and after the war, he had lost faith in a God that had allowed so many terrible things to happen. That is, until he met Francis. Francis was from Holden. I think they met in St. Louis. And he was baptized into Community of Christ. Francis was a church member. And his faith was rekindled as he understood the importance of the call of Zion and the worth of all persons. In 1982, Charles Neff was president of the Council of 12. And in his World Conference sermon at that conference, he spoke against nuclear weapons. He told the conference assembled of his recent participation in protests. And what was very controversial was he was thinking of withholding his taxes, part of which went for the building of nuclear weapons. This was a difficult sermon. There was Colleen Winholtz in the balcony. She was married to Wilfred Winholtz. They lived in Harvest Hills. And she was a former Quaker before she became RLDS. She was caught by the spirit of what Charles Neff had declared. And she stood up and she applauded. And soon everybody rose to their feet and applauded with her. It only takes a spark to get a whole crowd standing. It took the church 25 years to come out against nuclear weapons, but they did so in 1970. And then again, 2 resolutions in 1982, the same year that Neff gave his sermon, and then more recently in 2013. An extract from the resolution in 2013 goes like this. The Community of Christ joined the global voices seeking to halt nuclear weapons production, support prudent actions to minimize the threat or use of nuclear weapons, and urge renewed efforts towards eradication. Let me introduce you to the former mayor of Hiroshima, Dr. Tadashi Akiba. He received the church's International Peace Award in 2012 for his life's work in advocating for global nuclear disarmament. He started the program called Mayors for Peace, and Jim Hanna and others and independents went to see the mayor of the time and enrolled him in the Mayors for Peace program. Peter Salisbury, the mayor here in Leicester, is also part of Mayors for Peace. There's over 500 mayors worldwide. So this was a lovely moment for the church. ICAN, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. It's using the same legal strategy in partnership with maybe 400 or 500 other NGOs to abolish landmines, chemical and biological weapons. So landmines, chemical and biological weapons have been abolished by using this legal strategy, by making it illegal in international law. And ICAN has been pursuing this for nuclear weapons. Setsuko Thurlow, a Hiroshima survivor, but now a Canadian citizen, said, "To the leaders of the countries across the world, I beseech you, if you love this planet, you will sign this treaty." ICAN won the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. A great encouragement. Now, for the treaty to become international law, we need 50 countries to ratify it. Remember, things have to be ratified by individual countries. We're up to 43. 3 more countries, including Ireland, ratified on the 6th of August, 2 days ago. This is my daughter-in-law, Emily. She is vice moderator or co-moderator of the International Committee for the World Council of Churches. And this is my son, Matthew, the little boy who spoke at one time fluent Japanese in Tokyo with, I would say, I should tell you, a Tokyo accent. They also have been part of the ICAN effort. Matthew is an academic, Emily working with the World Council of Churches. And they were able to be in Oslo to witness ICAN receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. Emily has been encouraging various faith communities, Christian and Muslim and Sikh and Hindu and Buddhist, to sign the joint interfaith statement on this 75th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's been signed by Steve Veazey for the whole church, Andrew Fox for the British Isles, Joey Williams for Western Europe. I want to bring us back now to Kansas City, to the National Security Campus, to a more recent story. This is what the National Security Campus looks like. This scene from the air. This is a new factory. The old factory was down Bannister Ridge, I believe. This is a factory that makes 85% of an American nuclear bomb. It makes 85% of the delivery system of an American nuclear bomb. So this is on our doorstep. Of course, there are protests against this, and I want to tell you the story of Lou Mountenay. Lou used to work in the worship office. She's a quiet woman, spiritual, competent, thorough. And here she is being arrested. In 2013, she was one of 22 people arrested, one of 9 found guilty of trespass. She said when I interviewed her that her civil disobedience was out of divine obedience in protest to these terrible weapons. She was doing it for her children and for her grandchildren. The Kansas City balloted to stop funding for the new plant, but only got 23% of the vote. But she still wanted to protest. Rosa Parks' model was her defense. She was breaking, she thought, an unjust law. She came before Judge R.D. Bland, an African-American judge, and she had appeared before him before. The judge was sympathetic. He said, "You're educating me. Every time I learn something." He found her guilty, and his sentence was this: write a 1-page essay on each of 6 questions. It was good publicity, and the education of a judge continued. Lou, unfortunately, died a year or so ago of cancer. This is a protest march outside the facility, and you perhaps recognize R. Smith and Laura and their children with them. And now to tell you the story of ginkgo trees. This particular tree is 650 years old. You find ginkgo trees by Buddhist temples all over East Asia. They're a peace tree. And these are the characteristic leaves of the ginkgo tree. Now, the ginkgo tree is found in the fossil record. Now, you know dinosaurs are old. Well, ginkgos are twice as old as dinosaurs. Before dinosaurs were twinkles in God's eye, the ginkgo tree was. Now, the amazing story is that 6 ginkgo trees survived the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima without deformities. All 6 are still alive today. Besides being a tree of peace, they're a tree of hope, a tree of resurrection, a tree of life. There's a ginkgo tree on outside 611 West Maple. I used to walk to sometimes lunch by this tree on the square. So I know this tree well, and so did President Truman. He would tap the tree and say it was growing very well. I'm also amazed and surprised and impressed that an arch of 50 ginkgo trees surrounds the world plaza of the temple. Trees of peace for a peace temple. Trees of hope for a peace temple. So, concluding thoughts. What do we make of President Truman? I hope in my telling of President Truman that you have some idea of his very good qualities, that he knew Jules' granddad by name and would always greet him. I hope that in the telling of this story, I've also faced his very difficult decision, his anxiety to end the war, but possibly committing a terrible crime. I'm encouraged by Martin Luther King's words. in a sermon that he gave on loving our enemies. He said, within the best of us, there's some evil, and within the worst of us, some good. I want to also quote Roman Kent, an Auschwitz survivor, who said that we should have an 11th commandment. He said this on the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, now the 75th anniversary. He said the 11th commandment is this: you should never, never be a bystander. Never, never just observe and not do anything while something terrible is happening. So what can you do? Well, I'd like to invite you not to go to prison for trespass, but to write to your representative, your senator or member of parliament, urging that your country support the United Nations Nuclear Ban Treaty. Now, Britain, France, China, Russia, the United States, Israel, India, Pakistan have not signed this treaty. So if you're from any of these countries, do urge your government to repent, to change its mind. And if you're from a country which has signed this treaty, thank your representative. And if they've not yet signed, urge them to do so. In a Temple of Peace, we have a Japanese meditation garden, speaking of hope, of mutuality, of life between different peoples. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for sharing with us on this historic day. Also, thank you to Peter and Megan for helping co-host this program, and everyone who attended. Thank you for taking time out on your Saturday to remember this day and to hear more from Andrew Bolton. We are approaching the 1 o'clock hour, which is the prayer for peace that takes place in Independence. It will be Apostle David Neaty giving that prayer. I'm going to do a screen share over to the Community of Christ Facebook page where that prayer will take place live. Megan is going to drop the link to that Facebook page as well. In case things go awry with our screen sharing, you'll have the opportunity to click on Megan's link, and that'll take you directly over to the Community of Christ Facebook page where you can see Apostle Neaty share in that prayer for peace. Our program will end with that prayer for peace. So again, thank you, Andrew, and thank you to all of you for taking time out today to share with us.
Welcome to this time of praying for peace. As people who seek to follow Jesus, the peaceful one, we take these moments to uphold our commitment to actively engage in thoughts and actions that promote justice, leading to peace, reconciliation, and healing of spirit. We remember our call to the great and marvelous work of building the peaceable kingdom. My name is Dave Neaty, and today in our prayers, we remember the people of Jamaica, an island nation in the Caribbean Sea known for its beautiful beaches and waterfalls and the birthplace of reggae music. In addition, today we acknowledge the 75th anniversary of American President Harry S. Truman's signing of the ratification for the United Nations Charter. As stated in the preamble of the Charter, this worldwide organization, presently with 193 member nations, was founded with these ideals: to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights in the dignity and worth of all humanity, men and women of nations large and small, and to establish conditions that justice and respect for the obligation from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life, and to practice tolerance and live together in peace, and to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security, and to ensure that armed force shall not be used save in the common interest, and to promote economic and social advancement of all people. These admirable ideals are at the heart of our prayers for peace. Today's scripture reading is from the 9th Psalm, verses 7 through 11. But the Lord sits enthroned forever. He has established his throne for judgment. He judges the world with righteousness. He judges the peoples with equity. The Lord is a stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. And those who know your name put your trust in you, for you, O Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you. Sing praise to the Lord who dwells in Zion. Declare his deeds among the peoples. Please join me in prayer. God, divine light and love of existence, you speak and creation comes into being. Yet you yearn for people to embody and live the concerns and passions of Jesus, the peaceful one. We lift our prayers in a desire to hear and respond to your invitation and call. For far too long and in too many places, humanity has ignored your light that shines and leads to peace, healing, and joy. We acknowledge our blindness, yet we strive to take faithful steps to better reflect your light. We uphold the efforts of many courageous people who went before us as ambassadors of your grace and compassion for all people and all nations. We stand on their shoulders to work for an end to war, an end to injustice, an end to needless destructions of the bodies and spirits of people who simply seek to have their dignity and worth acknowledged. No one is insignificant, and no one should be invisible to those who wield political, economic, and social power. As we repent and turn from humanity's misdeeds of the past, help us move forward with love and compassion towards your purposes to make them reality on earth. Help us open our lives to your Spirit's leading. Help us set aside anything that prevents us from fully responding to your invitation and call. May the authentic, loving, Spirit-infused community that you desire for us grow within our hearts and daily interactions with others and creation. May the peace of Jesus flow in and through us. Amen. As we enter a time of guided prayer and meditation, you are invited to offer silent prayers or meditate during these moments of quiet. The prayers of the people begin with ourselves, then move outward to those we know and love, then to strangers and even enemies, to the world and all creation. So first, let us quiet our minds and hearts by noticing our breathing. Breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. God, we breathe in spirit and exhale those things that prevent us from experiencing you. We listen for the sound of the beloved's voice. Listen to the voice that invites you to surrender your fears and frustrations, anger and anxieties, and open our hearts to the peace that Christ brings. Allow the one who seeks only the best for you to offer comfort you seek. Listen to the voice that echoes across the eons of time and yet speaks anew in this moment. The earth shudders in distress because creation's natural and living systems are becoming exhausted from carrying the burden of our greed and conflicts. Listen to creation, which struggles to provide life in the seas, the hills, and the heavens above. Listen to the voice that calls all into unity and oneness. We specifically uphold the country of Jamaica. We hear the cries for mercy, forgiveness, and generosity. Listen to the one who reminds us that in the welfare of another reside our own well-being. Listen to the voice that confronts us to be at the forefront of organizations promoting the worth of all people. We struggle with the tensions felt 75 years ago on this date, when the birthing of a global community organization seeking lasting peace was observed in contrast to a nuclear bomb killing tens of thousands of women, children, and aged men. We seek ways toward lasting peace and harmony. God, may your vision of shalom be born anew in our hearts today. May Christ's mission of justice and peace overflow in our thoughts and actions. May our weapons of destruction be transformed into tools for creating healthy and authentic, loving communities of joy, hope, love, and peace. Amen. Thank you for participating in these moments of praying for peace. May we all be witnesses of hope. May we all work hard to right injustice, and may we actively make a difference in the world. Go in peace. Amen.